Episode 6 of the Wright County Restoration Project. Want to welcome you and thank you for listening in or watching or whatever the case may be. My name is Jamin. Very thankful to have you listening.
I'm Sam.
And today we are talking a Second Amendment.
Yes.
So now the Second Amendment, when we think about it, let's just dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll give a few opening introductory thoughts, and then kind of see where this takes us. Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Sam, I think that this is probably the most talked about of the amendments, probably the most written about, probably the most thought about in many ways.
Right.
And so there's not a lot necessarily that we can say here that hasn't been said in one way, shape, or form.
For sure.
But hopefully what we can do today is inform people a little bit. Obviously, Second Amendment rights groups, and there's a lot there, but kind of maybe peel through all of those layers of emotion and of anger and of fear and whatever it might be, and just kind of get to the brass tacks of what the founders were thinking, of what was going on at the time, of why the Second Amendment was necessary, and then also hopefully we can connect it kind of to a biblical idea a little bit as it relates to the militia, to keeping and bearing arms, to self-defense, to all of these ideas.
Absolutely. And it's funny because, this is a very but very much an American amendment.
Sure.
If you look at it, we don't really see this even today or in the past very much in any other part of the world. This is very American, and it's also very much loved by a great number of Americans.
Right.
You don't drive around and see somebody with the Third Amendment or the Fourth Amendment slapped on the back of their pickup truck. You see the Second Amendment. And so it's something that people are passionate about. In my line of work, I mix with a lot of people that are in what they call 2A culture or Second Amendment culture, where people are very passionate about preserving those rights. Yep. And understandably so. Even the founders thought of it as kind of the right that protects all your other rights.
Right.
Though even they would also say that's the last. That's the last thing you turn to.
Sure.
To preserve those liberties, but that's your last card, if you will. So, but yeah, it's a very hotly discussed thing. A lot of emotions involved in it, and I think we'll, at least for this talk, I think leaving a lot of the details about your barrel length and should you have the suppressor or not,
right,
and all that good stuff. There's other videos and information out there on all that. What I'd like to focus on more is how did we get to this point? What influenced the founders to put it in very early, right after the First Amendment. So freedom of speech, the press, freedom of assembly, right after it. There's the right to keep and bear arms. And we'll also get into a little bit of what the founders thought of as the militia, because that's also part of this that is misunderstood today. And what is a militia? Is this just talking about the militia? Is this talking about everybody? And our courts have said, yes, this is about individual liberty to keep and bear arms. So that's been pretty much cleared up. But why is the militia even added in here? Why is that important? Why did the founders say that was something to add here? So that's kind of the direction I'm thinking of going today, and hopefully it's informative.
Yeah, and as we think about it, very similar to what we mentioned as it related to the First Amendment, we don't see anything like, and you mentioned it's a very American amendment. We don't see any sort of enshrined right like this around the world. We've seen other places where they had the right to keep and bear arms given by their government. Right. And then at some point that gets pared back and then eventually revoked through mandatory buybacks and such, as a means by which to deal with crime or whatever the case may be. And of course, we won't get into all of the reverse issues with dealing with crime and owning firearms and whatever the case. But good. So why don't we dive right into what you've got there, and then we'll kind of talk about some of the biblical things after the fact.
Sounds good. So the first thing is interesting to look at. I'm going to take us to Blackstone's commentary on English law. This is really kind of some of the founding, the documents that the founders were pulling from. Blackstone was very much a resource that they pulled from, and it draws back to some of the stuff we talked about with some of the First Amendment and some of those things, and also when we kind of went into the unalienable rights. And so they very much saw this, boiling it down as the right to self-defense. And so here's a quote from Blackstone's commentary on the laws of England, and this kind of sums up what they would have been drawing from. So here's the quote: "This may be considered as the true palladium of liberty." Palladium meaning kind of linchpin or key part of it. "The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. Wherever standing armies are kept up, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction." So that's kind of summing things up. They really saw, and this bears out in other writings of the founders, they really saw the right to self-defense as kind of one of those laws of nature.
Yep.
They talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, and you need both because there's certain things we don't see necessarily in nature but are clearly laid out in the Scripture. But this is something that they see as a law of nature that God has given. You see it in nature that animals have been given instincts and tools. Some are more adept than others, but abilities to fight, to stay alive, to run, to flee from danger. It doesn't always work out. If you watch any nature videos, usually the zebra gets, eventually gets eaten by the lion. But there is that right to self-defense that we see throughout nature. And so that was something that they drew on quite heavily as they were drafting these documents. It's interesting, this starts out very early with the Plymouth colony in 1632. In their statutes, they had a very clear understanding, and they're on the edge of the frontier. Danger can come from a lot of different areas.
Right.
Other countries were trying to take land, so it might be the Spanish, might be the French. Also, you have Native Americans that they weren't sure about how friendly they were, that type of thing.
And there were some colonists in other places that had been very violent, and so they would retaliate against others and such.
Yep. So it was something that was very important to them. We talked about that around Thanksgiving, about that. And so here's their quote on what they had in their documents. This is what the Pilgrims and then the Puritans later. This is kind of their founding documents, and this is early on. This is 1632. So here's the quote: "That every free man or other inhabitant of the colony provide for himself and each under him able to bear arms a sufficient musket and other serviceable piece of war." Interesting. The spelling's very different than our spelling. It's but piece for war. It would be some sort of weapon. So that's and so that was kind of the layout in there, that each person was supposed to have one of these, and everybody who was basically able-bodied would have some sort of arms with them. Very important to them. Also, I think further on in those documents, they even regulate that if you're going to go further than a mile from your home, you're supposed to take it with you. So it was very much, they saw that as a crucial part of really survival in the frontier. And so that's kind of one of the earliest parts where we see that not only is given as a freedom, but also kind of regulated, that you are supposed to take this with you. You don't just leave it in the corner of the cabin. You take it out with you. You take it to meeting. You take it to to church. All that kind of thing is part of what they saw as a necessity and something they were freely exercising. And we see that continue on up until really the things start to heat up with England. The colonies pretty much, they from what we can tell, almost every at least male in the colonies after 16 and up had some sort of firearm available to them. It depended on, or the community would have at least firearms available in some sort of, they would either call it a magazine or some sort of place, a meeting house or some place where they would keep all these arms. And it turns out that's actually what really sparks off. That's what Lexington and Concord are all about, and we'll get into that later. But that these communities would have arms and munitions available for the men of that community, and those would be handed out for drill, and then also handed out in case of a civic emergency where those arms are needed.
I find it interesting as you read that quote that one of the things that was particularly mentioned there as it related to these firearms is that it was a weapon of war. And that's one of those phrases that gets bantered around today, that you can have your rifles, you can have your guns, but what you don't need are weapons of war. And it seems as though, and of course there's a lot of ideological back and forth and a lot of arguments and whatever else, but it is interesting that one of the things that they specified, in fact, was that you were to have a weapon of war, something that would make you capable of not just hunting or not just even that marginal self-defense, but of actually being useful to a war to a wartime band of men to be functionally useful in that purpose. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's it's been said other ways in different times, but that's clear. And if you do look at the founders, the Second Amendment's not about deer hunting. It's far more about leaving the tools to defend one's self, one's property, one's loved ones in the hands of the individuals of this country. And looking at the different quotes from our founders all through, they were very clear that leaving those tools in the hands of the average citizen was the best way to secure and preserve the liberties that they laid out here, and the liberties that they saw that God bestowed on us, and that the government was designed to protect those liberties, not to usurp those liberties.
And we could almost chalk this up at this point in history to anyone who reads it as common sense. Going all the way back to the Bible, we see that in the days of Saul and Jonathan, Saul and Jonathan were the only two in the entirety of Israel that had swords. Because the Philistines, the first thing that they did when they came into the land was they took every blacksmith out of the land specifically so that they could not make weapons of war, so that they could not defend themselves, and by not being able to defend themselves, they were put at a direct disadvantage in attempting to do so. So Saul and Jonathan had their swords, and everyone else had farm implements, and probably rather dull farm implements at that, and that was the extent of their army, specifically designed by their enemies in order to keep them under their thumb. And so this is it is effectively common sense that if we do not have the means by which to defend ourselves against enemies without or within, if we do not at least have the same amount of capability that they have, then liberty is in jeopardy.
Absolutely,
exactly as Blackstone said.
And that's very clear. And it has been a strategy, like you said, many times throughout history, to take the means of production of arms, whatever those are at that time in history, from the enemy. If you can limit those capacities, you effectively can win.
And whether that be an enemy from without or your own people, in the case of not wanting an uprising.
Absolutely. So what we see happen is in the 1770s, things really heat up in the colonies, and one of the things that's passed by Parliament is the Coercive Acts, and this came about the same time as the Boston Tea Party. They're putting together these things that are trying to it's not working very well, but their attempt was to try to quell this little rebellion, this unrest that they were seeing. What they did was actually pour gasoline on the fire instead of actually put it out. But one of the things that they put into place was acts to ban the import of firearms, and then also they laid out a plan for kind of a systematic confiscation of arms and powder. And these were things that were, they were looking to kind of, over time, take these things from the colonists who had stored them up for times of need. And so it becomes very clear that things are not going well when they go and the British are successful a couple different times in going and kind of doing these flash marches in to the countryside, because the British the garrisoned military tended to be in the major cities, but they would go out to the countryside, grab some things quickly, the powders, munitions, cannons, whatever, get back in before the militias were really able to form. And the militias being just the local men who drilled together. It wasn't, some little group off to the side. It was pretty much everybody. And so, and like I said, what happens is we see, kind of know the stories of Lexington and Concord, but the British kept doing this thing. This is also something you see in history where if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, your opponent quickly catches on, and then they cut you off. If you're trying to do these kind of campaigns. And so this is what happens. You have people like Paul Revere and others who send out, who realize something's happening around Boston, and the group that's coming out, the British are going out in search of firearms, cannons, and gunpowder and ammunition, and they get met by a small group at Lexington, and then later on a bigger group at Concord, and then they basically get harassed all the way back into Boston. And that, as we see historically, effectively starts the Revolutionary War, though it's still British fighting British, so it's really a civil war until we have the Declaration of Independence.
Right. Yeah, and you had mentioned there the nature of the militia. I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. And what, as we've talked about, what exactly that concept of the militia would look like. Is that something you want to talk about now, or do you have a few other things to say first?
Yeah, I was going to go into a little more of, actually I was going to kind of go into a little bit of the Declaration of Independence and the founders with that, so kind of what their thoughts were in regard to that. So. Okay, well, let's hit it. All right. So, interestingly, Richard Henry Lee is one of the founding fathers. He is the one that actually makes the motion for independence in the Congress that's working on the Declaration of Independence. And interestingly, if you look at his quotes, he's very clear on what this is all about in defense of the country. Here's the first quote I have here is from him, and he wrote these in a pamphlet called "Letters from a Federal Farmer to a Republican." But he wrote this information. So here's the quote: "To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms, and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them." So that's his first quote. Second quote here, also interesting. "A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and include all men capable of bearing arms." So that was his opinion, but as we can see throughout from other founders, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Washington, others, very similar quotes we find to this, that the militia is the people. It's not necessarily a specific group with a secret handshake or anything. It's not. It's state sanctioned. Right. It is the group in the community. It's the men above 16 years old and up. Usually about 60 was the cutoff, where they thought you were a little too old to take the rigors of a march or anything. And so that was that age range. And then you had, you basically were responsible to provide yourself with a firearm that would be serviceable and ammunition, and then be ready at whenever notice was given to be called up for either a muster or for some sort of duty that was needed in the community.
Sure.
So a last quote from Richard Henry Lee, and this one's also interesting. The Constitution ought to secure a genuine militia and guard against a select militia. So this is kind of, we're talking about different types of militias here. All regulations tending to render this general militia useless and defenseless by establishing a select corps of militia or distinct bodies of military men, not having permanent interests and attached to the community, ought to be avoided. So basically what he's saying there is not having permanent interests and attachments to the community ought to be avoided. He's talking about having men outside the community come in, and we've even seen this today with policing and other things, where men outside the community coming in and enforcing laws, even if they're community laws, still starts to get into muddy waters as far as people not having a vested interest, knowing who they're dealing with. It's much safer, and the Founding Fathers really saw it as an important thing to have, as having the people that enforce the laws that and defend a community to be the people within that community. Interestingly, we've kind of gotten quite a ways away from that in our current culture, but it's interesting to look back and see what, this was one of the signers of the Constitution, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Mistake there, but that this was his vision for what a militia was supposed to look like, and then on top of that, how important it was that people not only be well armed, but also trained in the use of those arms.
Right, and so as we look at the way that he, in particular, and we might say, and I think we can safely say the founders more generally, saw the concept of militia, they saw it in the same way that they would see any element of government, which was that you want to get it as local as possible, and you want to take as little, you want to give as little power as possible to a federal or a broad force, and we want to keep as much power as possible on the local level. This is one of the things that we talk about with policing when we talk about the nature of wanting to, defund the police or these sorts of ideas. The law of unintended consequences says that if you get rid of local police, then you're going to have something else step in and fill that void.
Right.
And if that thing that steps in is either a state police system or a federal policing system, then what you have, while you may have a little more accountability, you only have it until there is no accountability to be had. And then at that point, you have people that are from Tennessee that are enforcing laws in Minnesota, and they have no vested interest in Minnesota.
Right.
They have no vested interest in Buffalo. They have no vested interest in Wright County. And because they have no vested interest, because they don't know anybody, they're just a bunch of faces, they can be compelled to do things that are that no one would do to their own community.
Absolutely.
That they're anonymous and they are just looking at faces. And this is what we see on a military level throughout history as well. That when the military starts to become the police force or starts to enforce within their own borders, it enables a level of impersonal nature to enforcement, where you listen to great leader because great leader is the one that's paying your bill, and great leader is the one that you're loyal to, and you don't have any vested interest in the people that you're enforcing. And this is a very dangerous thing, as it is in any other area of government, where the federal government starts to strip away things from the communities that have a vested interest in their school systems, in their policing, in their water, in their electricity, or whatever the case may be.
Right, absolutely. And I think, it's clear just looking at how things played out throughout the Revolution, and later on, that this Second Amendment was very key to, it really struck at the heart of what started the revolution, and also they saw as a means for preserving these liberties. It's quoted that Benjamin Franklin, as he was heading out of the Constitutional Convention, somebody on the street asked him, "Sir, what have you given us? Have you given us a republic or a monarchy?" And Benjamin Franklin's response was something to the effect of, "A republic if you can keep it."
Right.
And that was something that they saw these different tools, whether it was the right to peaceably assemble, or the freedom of the press, or the right to keep and bear arms, were all these different tools that they were, and as we said before, are rights that are the people's,
Yep.
and that the government is just there to protect them, not to take them back or delegate them or infringe upon them, and that those were the tools that they were giving to their posterity to preserve these, this form of government that they've bestowed upon them.
Yeah, and it's hard to overstress the fact that the founding documents are documents that limit government, not enable government. That the whole point of them is to give them enumerated rights, and then everything that was not enumerated falls to the states, falls to local governments, falls to the people.
Right.
And that's a very important thing to remember, because it's so easy to shift into this idea, especially in an entitled culture or in a lazy culture that says, why isn't the government doing more? Why isn't there... why hasn't the government been empowered to fill in the blank? You see an injustice around you, the government should do something about it, when in fact the mindset of the founders was, no, if there's an injustice, you do something about it. Your churches do something about it. Your community do something about it, and leave it there, and don't empower the federal government. Don't empower an outside group of people to do something, because with every empowerment comes a stripping of rights.
Absolutely.
And of liberties.
And often the government does not either have the capability or the broad brush of regulation and other things tends to hurt those who are actually they're trying to protect. It's interesting. Thomas Jefferson, in his book, or his book called the Commonplace Book, said this about the regulating of firearms and of arms in general. Here's the quote. He said, "The laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature. They disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Since laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants, they serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man." So it's very kind of clearly laid out, but kind of what we've said before. An armed populace is a respectful populace and has that ability to defend themselves.
And all of those arguments that Thomas Jefferson just made are the same arguments that we go round and round with today. The idea that you're less likely to be attacked if people don't know whether you're armed or not.
Right.
A restaurant that has "we ban guns" on this premises is more likely to see an attack by an armed person than one that does not. And so these same arguments are actually being recycled. Perhaps we might understand from that the same arguments were being bantered back and forth in that day, and so we're fighting very much so the same battle.
Absolutely.
That was being fought in the days of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very interesting study, and I think even with what we're talking about here, we're just kind of touching on the surface of what really the founders all, believed and felt about this topic. But I think if you really dig into their quotes and their writings, you definitely see that there was no doubt in their mind as far as what they were talking about in this amendment. They were very clearly talking about giving people that right to defend themselves and to also have that well-regulated militia.
Yeah.
And that militia being nothing more than the people in that community. And that was something, and it wasn't just with the military. It was intended the way their writings are. It was intended to be the military,
Right.
And that there was not to be large standing armies, and that's something that even after the Civil War we still see large standing armies completely disband.
Yep.
For the most part, there is a small amount of military, they would call them regulars, that would guard military posts and military installations. But this was a very small number of people, and that the way war and militaries had been raised was through volunteers at the time when they were called up,
Right.
which, some may question why were we unprepared for things like World War II or other things, that much. But there was still that idea, even then, that you don't have a huge standing army until you call up all the people and get them all prepared for when the need arises. There wasn't the idea that we have a large standing army ready to go. And there are pluses and minuses to the system
Certainly.
as we have today, but it is interesting to even think there would be a very clear public either positive or negative effect, whether sometimes we talk about unjust wars and other things that we've been in, that if you had to call up a military force once you had declared war and once you had gotten yourself into something, it would be a very clear. You could see very clearly how readily people joined up, or if you had
Sure.
to do conscriptions or other things. Now, it's not a. It's kind of that kind of gets into a whole other thing, but it's interesting that that still would be it would be an interesting thermometer is telling the temperament of the people whether they felt that this was something that was needed to
Yep.
go and deal with, or it just wasn't something to go after.
Right, and even the ideas we think of Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm and whatever else, where these are all undeclared wars. These are wars where Congress has not voted
Right.
to actually declare war, and in that the Congress has not voted, it already muddies the waters. Whereas if you did not have a standing army, then you would have to have a declaration of war before a standing army would be assembled. So yes, certainly an interesting topic of pros and of cons that we could go through there, but very clear, to make it very clear as it relates to the Second Amendment, and we'll see this throughout, that there are any number of elements of even the Bill of Rights, much less the Constitution themselves, that have been at best muddied
Right.
in our current
Right.
society through time and circumstance. But as it relates to this idea of a militia, then the founders did not think of it certainly as a standing army, or necessarily as something that was selective, but
Right.
rather that every single person that was of age knew how to use a weapon, owned a weapon, and was ready, if necessary, to do what needed to be done for the community or for their protection and for their welfare.
Absolutely.
And that is what we would believe the founders would see from their own quotes as it relates to a militia. Again, a far cry from even how militia would be defined today.
Absolutely.
And the legalities of simply a group of men coming together and forming a group, which would, in most places and locales, be something which the various state and federal governments would have a real problem with.
Absolutely. And I think, you look at, clearly these, there's definitely issues that they would have, but there's, when you look back at the way things were handled, even in, when the colonies were still British colonies, you still had these groups that would form,
Yep.
and there would be, and that was definitely a big part of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, that these groups of militiamen would go out and fight alongside the regular troops from the king or queen at that time, and then those things come back, and then once the colonies declare independence, there's still something that it's continued on, and they're really they continue on quite a ways into even past the Civil War, and really become something else when the National Guard is federalized by FDR right at the outset of World War I. So it's something that was preserved through a lot of American history, but like you said, our idea in the mainstream media and others, even the word militia having different connotations has been muddied. The definitions have been changed, and it really was not the community, the armed men of the community.
You're right.
As the founders lay it out, as we see from their quotes and their writings.
Well, before we finish up here, we are pushing time. I want to take a few minutes to consider this as it relates to the Bible. We don't see anything very direct in the scriptures as it relates to a right to bear arms. As a matter of fact, we see significantly more, because the Bible is a spiritual book and directed toward Christians, in this idea of resisting not evil and various things. And there are any number of arguments that could be made when Jesus calls his disciples the second time to take a sword with them. And those arguments are perhaps familiar to many of our listeners. But what I wanted to think through a little bit here is the differentiation between how a nation forms itself and how a church forms itself.
Yeah.
So we call the Second Amendment, well, the way we described it, it's almost as if the Second Amendment is the underpinning of the rights. You have all of these rights that are God-given. And one of those rights, as we would see it in the Scripture, is not necessarily the right to firearms. We might say, in a sense, a right to self-defense, although for the Christian, that idea is not necessarily the case. As we look at what Jesus said about turning the other cheek and whatever else, we recognize that. But the difference between a church system and a government system is something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago in the First Amendment. And what we find is, as the Second Amendment being this underpinning right, one of the major differences that we see between humanism and Christianity or Judeo-Christian worldview is this idea that humanism has this conviction that men are naturally good. And because men are naturally good, that means that if we reduce poverty, if we increase education, then man will naturally he'll naturally stop he'll stop committing crimes, and he'll naturally make himself a productive member of society. And that, of course, leads into communism and this idea that we can redistribute the wealth without issue, because man will naturally become good and naturally be educated and naturally have what he needs to each according to each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Sort of an idea from each according to his ability to each according to his need, right? And yet we've never seen it bear out in history.
Right.
And this is that difference when we come to a Judeo-Christian worldview, recognizing that men are intrinsically sinful, and thus it is written in the heart of man to do evil. And as intrinsically sinful men, there's always going to be a bent toward power, a bent toward getting your own at the expense of others. And if this is our natural bent, then in order to secure religion, speech, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, there must be one of two things, as we've talked about before: self-governance, or there must be arms. The most powerful man or the self-governed man.
Right.
And as we've discussed here, in absence of the self-governed man, the necessity is that you want the good guy to have the gun. And this is really what the Second Amendment is.
Yeah.
The Second Amendment is the means by which for us to identify the various other God-given rights within a system of humanity that we understand to be fatally flawed, naturally sinful. And by virtue of the fact that man is naturally sinful and prone and predisposed unto evil, the necessity of having a means by which for the good guys to have the guns to stop the bad guy who refuses to govern himself by moral precepts is one that is essential, not just to the individual, but to the society against the tyrant. So we might see this as a recognition. It's a government instilled right that is intended to be the last line of defense for the God-given rights.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot more we could talk about as it relates to the Bible, which we don't simply have time to today. But I do want to, again, use that to paint this difference between humanism and Judeo-Christianity as it relates to a religious system that undergirds a worldview. Because within the humanistic worldview, it makes perfect sense that eventually guns should go away. As we get rid of poverty, as we increase education, crime goes away, guns go away. But that is an idealistic standpoint that is wholly based in faith and actually does not root itself in the reality of the world that God has created.
Right.
The world that God has created will always have a sinful bent until Jesus comes to make all things new.
Absolutely.
And therefore there must be a final line of defense whereby civilians and societies have a means by which to defend themselves and their freedoms and their rights against those who would seek to strip them away.
Absolutely. Well said.
Any final thoughts or considerations before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of look at the history that these things come from. It's interesting. It was new to me, some of the things that I learned a little bit about the militia, and something I'm probably going to do a little more study into. Where did that come from? Why was that so important? Why were these things so important to the founders? And like you said, it's something that we see a need for in society because, as the founders who clearly were students of the Word and studied the Bible and loved it, that they understood that man did need to have, if he was going to self-govern himself, that he needed to have, the tools with which to preserve the liberties that they were giving him. And I think, yes, we've come a long way in some different ways from that, but it is a blessing that this is still preserved to a great extent, to what we still have a Second Amendment. And, it's interesting, even with all the different cultures around the world being, test cases for, humanism or different types of government, we've really never seen a society where weapons in general were taken away from the population, and where peace and prosperity and people didn't really harm each other, and all that went away, and everything turned into a utopia. We just don't see that.
Right.
In a lot of different cultures around the world, and that's very clearly plays into the idea that man truly is, as the Bible says, sinful.
Yep.
and is in need of, of course, a savior, but also if he turns his back on that, there is need for law and government and the society to have that ability to govern him if he is not willing to be governed by anything else, versus the humanistic idea that his circumstances are the problem. It's very clear that, from a biblical point of view and the way we would see it, that, there's a need for a Second Amendment. Yeah,
because we are the problem.
Yeah.
And so we'll leave you with that this week. You are the problem, but not you specifically, of course, I hope. Thank you for joining us again today. Certainly, as we would desire you to continue. Like, subscribe. If you have any questions, we've set up an email address, and it's connected to the church that we're a part of right now. But I'd encourage you, WCRP, Wright County Restoration Project, WCRP at legacybaptistchurch.net. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And we will have that link, hopefully. I'll get it in the description below. And we'll enjoy bringing you more content. Amendment number 3, I would think, next week. And we'll dive into that and continue along this journey through the Constitution. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you next week.